Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most extraordinary underdog stories, a tale that has inspired countless generations and continues to captivate hearts around the world. We're exploring the journey of a shepherd boy whose faith proved mightier than the world's greatest warrior, whose trust in God transformed an impossible situation into legendary victory. This is the story of David and Goliath. But more than that, it's a story about how the Almighty prepares his champions not in palaces but in pastures, not through acclaim but through obscurity. It's about the moment when heaven met earth in a valley of conflict and a young man's faith shook the foundations of nations. So without further ado, let's begin. In the rolling hills of Judah, where ancient olive groves cast their silver shadows across terraced slopes, the small city of Bethlehem perched like a jewel on the limestone ridge. The name itself spoke of abundance, Beit Lecher, the house of bread. Yet in these troubled days of King Saul's reign, abundance felt like a distant memory. From the city's highest point, a shepherd could see the coastal plains where Philistine armies gathered like storm clouds, their bronze weapons glinting in the Mediterranean sun. To the east stretched the wilderness of Judea, harsh and unforgiving, where David's great-great-grandmother Ruth had once gleaned barley in these very fields, never imagining that her lineage would one day shake the foundations of nations. The younger son of Jesse walked these hills with the measured pace of one who had learned patience from watching sheep. At perhaps 16 years old, David possessed the lean strength of youth tempered by responsibility beyond his years. While his 7 older brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, Shammah, Nethaneel, Raddai, Ozem, and the others, had marched off to serve in King Saul's army, someone had to remain with the family's flock. In the ancient Near East, this was no small responsibility. Sheep represented wealth, sustenance, and survival itself. A family's flock was their insurance against famine, their source of wool for clothing, milk for nourishment, and meat for sacred offerings. To lose even a few sheep to predators or neglect could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty. The work shaped him in ways that palace education never could. Each dawn found the young shepherd leading his charges from the stone sheepfold near Bethlehem's walls to the pastures beyond. The rhythm of pastoral life moved to seasons older than kingdoms. The careful rotation of grazing lands to prevent overuse, the constant vigilance for signs of sickness in the flock, the delicate art of finding water sources in a land where rainfall came only in winter months. But it was in the long hours of solitude, watching sheep spread across hillsides like scattered pearls, that something deeper was being forged in the heart of Jesse's youngest son. The pastoral landscapes of ancient Judah demanded a particular kind of courage. Lions still prowled these hills, their tawny forms slipping through the shadows of wadis and caves. Syrian brown bears, massive creatures standing nearly 8 feet tall on their hind legs, descended from the forests of Lebanon to raid flocks in the dry season. For a shepherd boy armed with nothing but a staff, a sling, and unwavering determination, each encounter with these predators became a test of character that no royal academy could provide. The sling itself was far from the simple toy that later generations would imagine. In the hands of an expert, this ancient weapon could drive a smooth stone with the force of a modern bullet. Made from leather or woven sheep's wool, with a pouch for the stone and 2 cords of carefully measured length, a shepherd's sling required years to master. The technique demanded perfect timing. The stone released at precisely the right moment in the weapon's rotation, the trajectory calculated by instinct and experience. Shepherds across the Mediterranean world were renowned for their marksmanship, able to strike a target the size of a man's head at distances exceeding 100 yards. But mastery of the sling was only part of David's education in those Bethlehem pastures. The solitude taught him to listen, to the subtle changes in wind direction that warned of approaching storms, to the different bleating sounds that indicated contentment, distress, or danger among his sheep. He learned to read the sky like a scroll, interpreting the movement of clouds and the colour of distant horizons. Most importantly, in the vast silence of the wilderness, he learned to hear another voice altogether. The young shepherd carried with him a simple harp, 10 strings stretched across a wooden frame small enough to hold in one arm. During the long watches of night, when wolves howled in the distance and his flock huddled close for warmth, David's fingers found melodies that seemed to flow from some source beyond his own imagination. The words came too, poetry that captured both the beauty of creation and the majesty of its creator. The heavens declare the glory of God, he would sing to his sheep and to the star-scattered sky, and the firmament shows his handiwork. These were not merely pretty verses composed for entertainment. In the ancient world, music carried power that modern minds struggle to comprehend. It was believed that certain melodies could calm troubled spirits, that rhythm and harmony could align the human soul with cosmic order. The shepherd boy discovered this truth through experience, watching how his music could settle a restless flock or draw wild animals to peaceful distance. What he did not yet understand was how this same gift would one day bring him before kings and transform the course of nations. The political situation that formed the backdrop of David's youth was precarious in the extreme. King Saul, Israel's first monarch, had begun his reign with such promise, tall and handsome, chosen by the prophet Samuel in response to the people's demand for a king like all the nations. Saul had initially led Israel to stunning military victories. His routing of the Ammonites at Jabesh-Gilead had seemed to herald a new era of strength and prosperity, but power had proven a corruption that even divine anointing could not prevent. The king's disobedience at Gilgal, where he had presumed to offer sacrifices reserved for priests, marked the beginning of his spiritual decline. His incomplete obedience regarding the Amalekites, sparing King Agag and the best of their livestock when God had commanded total destruction, had prompted Samuel's devastating pronouncement, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbour of yours who is better than you." But the kingdom's transfer would not come easily or quickly. Saul remained on the throne, his reign growing increasingly erratic as divine favour departed from him. Meanwhile, the Philistines, that sophisticated sea people who had migrated from the Aegean world, pressed their advantage with calculated aggression. Their superior iron-working technology gave them weapons that could shatter Israel's bronze implements like pottery. Their organised military structure, borrowed from Mycenaean warfare traditions, could deploy coordinated units of infantry, archers, and chariots with devastating effect. From their Pentapolis, the 5 great cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, Philistine armies probed deeper into Israelite territory each campaigning season. They controlled the coastal trade routes and the lucrative metallurgy industry, monopolizing iron production to keep their neighbours technologically dependent. No blacksmith was allowed to operate in Israelite territory. Even agricultural tools had to be sharpened in Philistine cities, ensuring both economic submission and military vulnerability. It was into this world of constant threat that David had been born, a world where survival itself required both cunning and courage. The shepherd boy understood, perhaps better than the politicians in Jerusalem, that Israel's real strength lay not in superior weapons or military alliances, but in their covenant relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Each time he faced down a lion or bear to protect his sheep, each time he trusted his sling against impossible odds, his faith grew stronger and his understanding deeper. The spiritual symbolism of shepherding was not lost on young David, though its full implications would only become clear in the years ahead. In the ancient Near East, kings were commonly referred to as shepherds of their people, responsible for protecting, guiding, and providing for those under their care. The Egyptian pharaohs bore the shepherd's crook as a symbol of the royal authority. Mesopotamian rulers from Sargon to Hammurabi claimed the title of shepherd king. But David was learning these lessons not in the theoretical realm of royal education, but in the practical reality of daily responsibility for vulnerable creatures. Every lamb that he carried home on his shoulders when it strayed too far, every time he led the flock to still waters and green pastures, every night he stood watch against predators, all of it was preparation for a calling he could not yet imagine. The boy who would one day write, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," was learning in the most visceral way possible what it meant to be a good shepherd himself. Jesse's household in Bethlehem was prosperous by the standards of their time, owning substantial flocks and enjoying the respect of their neighbours. The The family traced their lineage back through Obed to Boaz, the wealthy landowner who had married Ruth the Moabitess, in a story that had become legend throughout Judah. But prosperity brought its own responsibilities, and Jesse understood that his family's survival depended not just on their flocks, but on their relationship with the larger community and the political powers that governed their lives. When King Saul had called for military levies from every tribe and family, Jesse had responded by sending his older sons to serve in the royal army. It was both a patriotic duty and a shrewd political calculation. Families that failed to contribute to the kingdom's defence could find themselves excluded from trade opportunities, legal protections and social advancement. But Jesse was also wise enough to keep his younger son at home, ensuring that someone would remain to maintain the family's economic foundation. David's brothers served in various capacities within Saul's military structure. Eliab, the eldest, had risen to the rank of company commander, leading a unit of perhaps 50 men in the constant skirmishes that marked Israel's borders. Abinadab and Shammah served as experienced infantry, their skill with sword and spear earning them recognition among their peers. The younger brothers filled supporting roles, logistics, communications, and specialized combat duties that kept Saul's army functioning in the field. But military service in Saul's day was a far cry from the organized professional armies of later empires. Israel's forces were essentially a tribal militia, called up for specific campaigns and then dispersed back to their homes and occupations. Warriors brought their own weapons, provided their own food, and served without pay beyond what they could capture from defeated enemies. Leadership positions were often based more on tribal politics and personal relationships than on military competence. The result was an army that could show flashes of brilliance in battle, but lacked the sustained organizational capacity to project power beyond Israel's immediate borders. This military reality shaped the daily anxiety that pervaded communities like Bethlehem. Philistine raids could strike with little warning, targeting livestock, grain stores, and anything else of value. Young men and women could be carried off as slaves, their families left to mourn and wonder if they would ever see their children again. Trade routes became uncertain, with merchants frequently robbed or killed by raiders operating in the borderlands between kingdoms. For a shepherd like David, these threats were more than abstract political concerns. They were daily realities that could destroy his family's livelihood in a single night. A successful raid on their flocks could reduce the household of Jesse from prosperity to poverty in a matter of hours. This knowledge added urgency to every decision, weight to every responsibility, and steel to the young man's growing determination to protect what he held dear. Yet it was in these very circumstances that David's character was being forged like iron in a blacksmith's fire. The combination of responsibility, danger, and solitude created a unique environment for spiritual and emotional development. Unlike his brothers, who learned leadership in the company of other men, David learned it in isolation, responsible not to human commanders, but to the needs of vulnerable creatures and the demands of his own conscience. The theological implications of this preparation would only become clear in retrospect. The God of Israel was training his future king not in the halls of power, but in the hills of Judah, not among the politically sophisticated, but among defenseless sheep. The lessons David learned about protection, provision, and sacrifice in those pastures would one day reshape how an entire nation understood leadership itself. The ruins of ancient cities scattered throughout Judah tell the story of David's world in stark, silent testimony. At Tel Beth Shemesh, just a few miles from Bethlehem, the remains of a once prosperous Israelite city rise from the earth. Sophisticated urban planning, metallurgy workshops, and massive storage facilities for agricultural surplus. Here was a society caught between worlds, adopting Philistine technologies while clinging to their Hebrew heritage and religious traditions. Broken pottery scattered across the site bears inscriptions in early Hebrew script, evidence of widespread literacy among the upper classes. Stone seals and carefully crafted weights speak of a developed commercial economy, complete with standardized measures and legal documentation. The terraced hillsides throughout Judah reveal the intensive farming methods that allowed dense populations to flourish in this semi-arid land. Most telling of all are the signs of constant warfare that marked David's era. Layer upon layer of destruction at site after site tells the same brutal story. Repeated conflicts that devastated communities again and again. The distribution of iron weapons reveals the technological gap that gave Philistine forces such deadly advantage over their bronze-armed opponents. Hidden cache pits, where families desperately buried grain and valuables, speak to a harsh reality. Ordinary people lived with the daily expectation that enemy raiders might strike without warning. It was against this backdrop of beauty and danger, prosperity and vulnerability, that David spent his formative years. Each day brought new lessons in the fundamental realities that would later define his kingship, that strength comes not from superior weapons but from superior character, that true leadership means willing sacrifice for those under your care, and that ultimate victory belongs not to the largest army but to those who trust completely in the power of the living God. The young shepherd could not have known, as he guided his flock through the valleys and hills around Bethlehem, that these quiet years were preparation for a destiny that would echo through millennia. He could not have imagined that the boy who faced down lions and bears in defense of his sheep would one day face down a giant in defense of his nation. But in the providence of God, nothing was wasted. Not the lonely hours of watching, not the nights of danger, not the simple songs that rose from a grateful heart under the canopy of stars. In those hills of Judah, where Abraham had once walked, and where David's great-great-grandmother Ruth had once gleaned grain, the future king of Israel was learning the most important lesson of all, that greatness is not about the acclaim of men, but about faithfulness in small things, not about commanding armies, but about caring for the vulnerable, not about wielding power, but about trusting in the one who holds all power in his hands. As seasons turned and years passed, the shepherd boy grew in stature and in wisdom, his reputation for skill and courage spreading throughout the region. But more importantly, he grew in his understanding of the character of God, the God who watches over his people as a shepherd watches over his flock, the God who delivers the righteous from the mouth of the lion, the God who prepares his chosen servants in hidden places before revealing them to the world. The stage was being set for a drama that would unfold far beyond the hills of Bethlehem, but the foundation was being laid in those very hills, stone by stone, day by day, test by test. The boy who would one day be called the man after God's own heart was learning what it truly meant to have a heart like God's, protective, sacrificial, and absolutely committed to the welfare of those entrusted to his care. The madness descended upon King Saul like a vulture circling wounded prey, settling over his mind with talons that gripped tighter with each passing day. In the royal chambers of Gibeah, where once the tall king had stood magnificent in his purple robes, receiving ambassadors and dispensing justice with the wisdom of his office, now there paced a tortured soul whose eyes held the wild look of a man haunted by invisible demons. It had begun subtly, this spiritual torment that Samuel had prophesied, a strange restlessness during court proceedings, moments of confusion when addressing his commanders, sudden bursts of irrational rage over trivial matters. The servants whispered that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from their king, leaving behind a vacuum that something dark and malevolent had rushed to fill. They spoke in hushed tones of the evil spirit that now tormented Saul, sent by God himself as judgment for the king's persistent disobedience. The transformation was devastating to witness. Saul, who had once commanded respect through his physical presence and natural leadership, now inspired fear and pity in equal measure. His advisers never knew which version of their king they would encounter, the lucid, capable ruler who could still display flashes of his former brilliance, or the manic, suspicious tyrant who saw enemies in every shadow and betrayal in every gesture. The episodes grew worse with each passing week. Servants found the king in his private chambers, talking animatedly to empty air, responding to voices that no one else could hear. He would spend hours staring at blank walls, his jaw working silently as if chewing words too terrible to speak aloud. Sometimes he would suddenly leap to his feet and pace the room like a caged leopard, his hands clenching and unclenching, as if grasping for weapons that weren't there. His family bore the brunt of this psychological collapse. Jonathan, his brave and noble son, watched helplessly as the father he admired dissolved before his eyes. Michal, his daughter, learned to read the warning signs in her father's expression and to vanish from sight when the darkness descended. The palace staff developed an intricate system of signals and escape routes, knowing that the king's fury could erupt without warning and with devastating consequences. But it was during the musical presentations at court that Saul's condition became most apparent to visiting dignitaries and tribal leaders. Music held sacred power in the ancient world, believed to influence the very fabric of reality, to heal the sick and calm the troubled. In Israel's tradition, music was especially potent, a direct channel to the divine realm, capable of invoking God's presence or driving away evil influences. Yet when the court musicians played their harps and lyres, when the trained singers lifted their voices in the ancient songs of praise, Saul's torment only seemed to intensify. The professional musicians tried everything in their considerable repertoire. They performed the victory songs that had once stirred the king's heart to courage, the liturgical pieces that honoured the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, even the gentle lullabies that mothers sang to quiet restless children. Nothing worked. If anything, the traditional music seemed to agitate the evil spirit that tormented their king, causing Saul to writhe in his chair or storm from the room in fury. It was Saul's armour-bearer, a young man named Ahinoam who had served in the household since childhood, who first suggested seeking a different kind of musician. "My lord," he said carefully, approaching the king during one of his clearer moments, "perhaps what troubles you requires a different kind of music. Something pure, something untainted by the complexities of court life." The suggestion sparked intense debate among Saul's advisers. Some argued for bringing in foreign musicians, perhaps from the Phoenician cities, where musical traditions were said to have magical properties. Others suggested consulting the priests at the various shrines throughout Israel, seeking their guidance on what melodies might appease whatever supernatural forces were tormenting their king. But it was another servant, a man from Bethlehem who had come to court on business related to military provisions, who mentioned the young shepherd he had observed during his visit to Jesse's household. "There is a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite," he said, "who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valour, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." The description was intriguing for several reasons. Here was not merely a musician, but a young man whose character encompassed multiple virtues that Saul desperately needed around him. Skillful in playing, the technical competence was essential, given that poor musicianship could make the king's condition worse rather than better. A mighty man of valour. Courage would be necessary for anyone who dared approach the king during his episodes of madness. Prudent in speech, wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent was crucial in navigating the treacherous waters of Saul's unstable moods. Most significantly, the servant had noted that the Lord is with him. In an age where divine favour was considered both visible and transferable, this was perhaps the most important qualification of all. If indeed the young shepherd carried some measure of God's blessing, perhaps that spiritual anointing could counteract the evil influence that plagued their king. Saul, grasping at any possibility of relief from his torment, immediately dispatched messengers to Jesse in Bethlehem. The message was both a royal command and a desperate plea. "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Jesse, understanding the gravity of such a summons and the opportunity it represented for his family, carefully prepared his response. Along with his youngest son, he sent a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat. Gifts appropriate for a king, but not so ostentatious as to suggest presumption or pride. The journey from Bethlehem to Gibeah covered roughly 10 miles of hill country, but for David it might as well have been 10,000 miles of foreign territory. The shepherd boy, who had spent his entire life among the familiar landscapes of Judah, now found himself approaching the nerve centre of Israelite political power, a world where every word carried weight, and every gesture might be interpreted as either loyalty or treason. Gibeah itself was a modest capital by the standards of the great empires, but to a young man from rural Bethlehem it must have seemed overwhelming. Built on a commanding hilltop, the city's fortifications reflected both Israel's military needs and their limited resources. Unlike the massive stone walls of Canaanite cities or the sophisticated engineering of Philistine strongholds, Gibeah's defences were practical and austere, earthworks reinforced with stone, gates designed for quick deployment of troops rather than impressive display. The royal palace was similarly functional rather than ornate. Saul had consciously chosen to maintain a lifestyle that reflected Israel's tribal traditions rather than imitating the luxury of surrounding monarchies. The building was essentially an enlarged version of a prosperous farmer's house, with additional rooms for administrative functions and guest quarters for visiting dignitaries. The throne room was modest by royal standards, a large chamber with simple stone benches along the walls and a wooden chair, elevated but not ostentatious, where the king held court. Yet to David, accustomed to the simple stone houses of Bethlehem and the open sky of the pastures, even this modest palace must have felt intimidating. The corridors buzzed with activity as scribes, military officers, and tribal representatives conducted the business of government. Armed guards stood at strategic points, their bronze-tipped spears and leather armour marking them as professional soldiers rather than the simple militia that protected rural communities. The cultural shock went deeper than mere physical differences. Court life operated according to complex protocols that David had never encountered. How should one approach the king? What words were appropriate for addressing royalty? When should one speak, and when should one remain silent? The wrong gesture or phrase could be interpreted as disrespect, potentially resulting in punishment or dismissal. But if David felt overwhelmed by his new environment, he showed no sign of it when finally brought before King Saul. The young shepherd entered the throne room with the quiet confidence of one who had faced down lions and bears, whose courage had been tested in circumstances where failure meant death. His simple shepherd's clothing marked him as an outsider, but his bearing suggested inner strength that impressed even the jaded courtiers who had seen countless ambitious young men seek royal favour. Saul's first impression of David was remarkably positive, despite the king's deteriorating mental state. The young man's physical appearance certainly helped. He was ruddy, with bright eyes and good-looking, possessing the kind of natural attractiveness that commanded attention, without seeming calculated or artificial. But more importantly, there was something in David's demeanour that immediately distinguished him from the typical hangers-on who sought positions at court. Where other young men might have been nervous or obsequious in the presence of royalty, David displayed what could only be described as peaceful confidence. He had spent too many nights alone under the stars, too many days in the presence of the Almighty's creation, to be intimidated by human power, no matter how impressive its trappings. This was not arrogance or disrespect. Quite the contrary. David showed proper deference to the king's office, but underneath his respectful manner lay an unshakable confidence in the God who had protected him in the wilderness and brought him to this moment. When Saul commanded him to play, David's performance was unlike anything the court had ever experienced. The professional musicians had been trained in the formal traditions of Israelite liturgy, their technique polished through years of study and practice. Their music was correct, competent, and utterly predictable. David's music was something altogether different, wild and free as the wind across the hills of Judah, yet structured with an internal logic that spoke to something deeper than mere entertainment. The young shepherd's harp was a simple instrument compared to the elaborate lyres and harps that graced the royal court. 10 strings stretched across a wooden frame worn smooth by countless hours of playing, it looked almost primitive beside the ornate instruments crafted by master artisans for the king's pleasure. But in David's hands, this simple harp became a conduit for something that transcended mere technique. The melodies that flowed from his fingers had been born in solitude, tested in the crucible of real danger, refined through years of communion with the Creator. These were not songs learned from human teachers, but compositions inspired by divine encounter, the shepherd's response to sunrises that painted the hills of Judah in gold and crimson, to nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, to moments when the presence of God had been so real that the very air seemed to shimmer with holy light. The effect on Saul was immediate and profound. As David's music filled the throne room, something shifted in the king's tortured features. The wild look faded from his eyes, replaced by an expression of wonder and peace that his servants had not seen in months. The tension that had coiled his body like a spring ready to explode began to ease, his shoulders relaxing, his hands unclenching from the arms of his throne. More remarkably still, the very atmosphere of the room seemed to change. The oppressive weight that had settled over the palace like a suffocating blanket began to lift. Servants who had grown accustomed to tiptoeing through their duties found themselves breathing more easily. Guards who had learned to watch their king with constant vigilance began to relax their stance. Even the courtiers, who had grown skilled at reading the king's moods for their own survival, noticed the transformation. But perhaps most significantly of all, the evil spirit that had tormented Saul was forced to retreat. Whether one understands this in terms of literal demonic influence or psychological healing, the result was undeniable. The young shepherd's music had accomplished what months of professional treatment had failed to achieve. The presence of God that accompanied David's playing drove back the darkness that had engulfed their king. This was spiritual warfare in its purest form, though David himself might not have fully understood the cosmic dimensions of what was occurring. His music was not merely therapeutic, it was prophetic, a declaration of God's sovereignty over all the powers of darkness. Each note proclaimed that the God of Israel still reigned, that his purposes would not be thwarted by human disobedience or supernatural opposition. The immediate practical result was that David found himself appointed to a permanent position in Saul's household. The king loved him greatly and made him his armor-bearer, a position of considerable trust and responsibility. The armor-bearer was more than a mere servant. He was a companion in battle, responsible for protecting the king's equipment and often his life. The appointment spoke to Saul's immediate recognition of David's character and potential. For a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, this elevation to royal service represented an extraordinary transformation of circumstances. Suddenly, David found himself at the centre of Israelite political and military life, privy to strategic discussions that would shape the destiny of nations. He observed firsthand how kingdoms were governed, how armies were organised, how diplomacy was conducted. Without realising it, he was receiving the education that would later enable him to rule Israel more effectively than any of his predecessors. But the transition was not without its challenges. Palace life operated according to rhythms utterly different from pastoral existence. Instead of the natural cycles of sunrise and sunset that had governed his days as a shepherd, David now found himself subject to the artificial schedules of court life. Meals were served at prescribed times, duties performed according to rigid protocols, social interactions governed by complex hierarchies that bore no resemblance to the simple relationships of rural life. The political environment was particularly treacherous for someone with David's straightforward nature. Court life bred suspicion and intrigue as naturally as stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. Ambitious men jockeyed for position, forming alliances and plotting against rivals with strategies that would have made Machiavelli proud. Information was currency, secrets were weapons, and loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a virtue to be treasured. David's very presence in this environment created ripples of speculation and concern. Who was this shepherd boy who had gained such immediate favour with the king? What family connections had secured his appointment? What advantages was he seeking to gain? The courtiers who had spent years carefully cultivating their relationships with Saul now found themselves potentially displaced by a young man whose only qualification seemed to be his ability to calm the king's troubled spirit. Yet David navigated these treacherous waters with the same wisdom that had served him well in protecting his sheep from predators. He spoke little and observed much, learning to read the subtle currents of palace politics without becoming entangled in them. His loyalty to Saul was genuine rather than calculated, based on respect for the king's office rather than personal ambition. This authenticity, so rare in the world of royal courts, gradually won him supporters even among those who had initially viewed him with suspicion. The young man's military education began immediately upon his appointment as armor-bearer. Israel's army in Saul's time was a far cry from the professional forces that would later dominate the ancient world. It was essentially a citizen militia, called up for specific campaigns and then dispersed back to their farms and trades. Leadership was based more on tribal loyalties and personal relationships than on military competence, resulting in an organization that could display flashes of brilliance, but lacked the consistent effectiveness of truly professional forces. David observed all of this with the keen eye of someone who understood that his life might depend on the army's effectiveness. He studied the organization of units, the deployment of different types of troops, the logistics of keeping an army fed and equipped in the field. He learned the strengths and weaknesses of various weapons, the tactics that worked against different types of enemies, the importance of morale in determining the outcome of battles. Most importantly, he began to understand the spiritual dimensions of warfare that distinguished Israel from all other nations. This was not merely a matter of military strategy, but of covenant relationship with the God who had delivered their ancestors from Egypt and given them the land of promise. Victory or defeat often had less to do with numerical superiority or superior weapons than with the nation's faithfulness to their divine calling. The contrast between David's quiet confidence and Saul's increasing instability became more pronounced as weeks turned to months. While the young shepherd brought peace to the king through his music, he also served as an unwitting reminder of what Saul had lost through his disobedience. David's obvious favour with God highlighted the spiritual barrenness that now characterised the king's life, creating a bitter irony that would eventually prove explosive. Yet for now there was a period of relative stability in the royal household. David's music provided Saul with relief from his torment, while his presence offered a calming influence that benefited the entire court. The young man divided his time between his duties as armor-bearer and periodic returns to Bethlehem to help his family with their flocks, maintaining his connection to the pastoral life that had shaped his character. During these months of service in Saul's court, David was unknowingly being prepared for a destiny that would far exceed anything he could have imagined as a shepherd boy in Bethlehem. He was learning statecraft from the inside, observing both the possibilities and the pitfalls of royal power. He was studying military science under the pressure of real conflicts with real consequences. Most importantly, he was developing the diplomatic skills and political wisdom that would later enable him to unite a fractured nation and establish a dynasty that would endure for centuries. But perhaps most significantly of all, David was learning to navigate the complex relationship between divine calling and human institutions. How could someone remain faithful to God while serving in systems that often seem to work against God's purposes? How could one maintain integrity while surrounded by corruption? How could one prepare for future responsibility while remaining humble in present circumstances? These questions would become even more urgent as David's reputation began to spread beyond the confines of the royal court. Stories of the young shepherd who could calm the king's madness began to circulate throughout Israel, creating a buzz of speculation about this remarkable young man. Some saw him as a sign of hope in increasingly dark times. Others viewed him as a potential threat to the established order. The stage was being set for events that would transform not only David's life, but the entire trajectory of Israel's history. In the royal armoury, weapons were being sharpened for conflicts that would determine the survival of the kingdom. In the hills of Judah, enemy forces were gathering strength for what they hoped would be a decisive campaign. And in the courts of Gibeah, a young man was being prepared by the hand of providence for a confrontation that would echo through the ages. The shepherd boy who had learned courage in defending his father's flock was about to discover that God had been preparing him for a far greater test, one that would require not only physical bravery, but absolute faith in the power of the Almighty to deliver his people from impossible odds. The music that had driven evil spirits from the king's presence was about to give way to a different kind of spiritual warfare, one that would be fought not in the shadowed corridors of the palace, but in the bright sunlight of a valley where giants walked and destinies were decided. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping giants, swirling around the ancient terebinth trees that gave Elah its name. This broad depression in the Judean foothills had witnessed countless confrontations throughout history, its strategic position making it a natural corridor between the Philistine coastal plains and the hill country of Judah. But never had it hosted a standoff quite like this one, where two armies faced each other across a ravine that might as well have been an ocean, paralysed not by military strategy but by supernatural terror. On the southern ridge, the army of Israel sprawled in an uncomfortable amalgamation of tribal units, their bronze weapons glinting dully in the pale sunlight. 40,000 men had answered King Saul's call to arms, representing every tribe from Dan to Beersheba, yet they huddled in their positions with the posture of condemned prisoners rather than warriors preparing for battle. Their camp bore all the hallmarks of an army that had lost its will to fight: cooking fires that burned low to avoid drawing attention, conversations conducted in whispers, sentries who watched their own valley floor with more dread than they observed the enemy positions. Across the ravine, perhaps 600 yards of broken ground away, the Philistine army presented a vastly different spectacle. Their formations displayed the disciplined precision of professional soldiers trained in the military traditions of the Aegean world. Rank upon rank of infantry stood in perfect alignment, their iron-tipped spears creating a forest of deadly points that gleamed like silver in the morning light. Behind them, archers tested their bowstrings with the casual confidence of men who had used these weapons to conquer cities and topple kingdoms. The Philistine camp bustled with activity that spoke of absolute confidence in their eventual victory. Smiths worked openly at their forges, sharpening weapons and repairing armour with the unhurried efficiency of craftsmen who knew their services would soon be in high demand. Supply wagons moved freely between the tents, their drivers showing no concern for Israelite archers or surprise attacks. These were men who had calculated the odds and found them overwhelmingly in their favour. At the centre of the Philistine formation stood a pavilion that dwarfed all others, its purple and gold fabric snapping in the wind like a banner of inevitable triumph. This was the command tent of their champion, and around it clustered the elite warriors of Gath, men whose very presence on any battlefield had become synonymous with victory. They polished their weapons with ritual care, checked and rechecked their armour, and spoke in low tones of the battle to come with the casual anticipation of men discussing the weather. For 40 days this strange military ballet had continued unchanged. Each morning, as the sun climbed above the eastern hills, the armies would deploy in their traditional formations and settle into positions that had become as familiar as furniture in a long-occupied house. The Israelites would array themselves along their ridge with elaborate care, maintaining the illusion that they were preparing for serious combat. The Philistines would respond with their own deployment, going through the motions of a conventional military engagement, while everyone involved understood that this was no ordinary conflict. Because every morning, as predictable as sunrise itself, the true purpose of this gathering would reveal itself in a spectacle that had transformed seasoned warriors into trembling spectators. The sound came first, footsteps that seemed to make the earth itself groan in protest, each impact reverberating through the rocky ground like distant thunder. Then the shadow would appear at the mouth of the Philistine camp, a darkness so immense that it seemed to swallow the light around it, and finally the champion himself would emerge into the valley, and 40,000 Israelite hearts would collectively forget how to beat. Goliath of Gath stood nearly 10 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and bone wrapped in bronze that caught the sunlight and threw it back in blinding flashes. His armour had been crafted by the finest smiths of the Philistine cities, each piece designed not merely for protection, but for psychological warfare. The bronze helmet that covered his massive head was worked with intricate designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the changing light. His breastplate, weighing more than most men could lift, bore the insignia of victories that had made his name a whisper of terror from Egypt to Damascus. But it was his weapons that truly captured the imagination and paralysed the will. The spear he carried casually in one hand possessed an iron head that weighed 15 pounds, mounted on a shaft as thick as a weaver's beam and nearly as long as a cedar tree. The javelin that hung at his side could punch through any armour ever forged, while the sword strapped across his back was broad enough to cleave a man in half with a single stroke. Even his shield, carried by a dedicated armor-bearer who jogged to keep pace with the giant's massive strides, was large enough to serve as a roof for an ordinary dwelling. Each morning Goliath would position himself precisely in the centre of the valley floor, equidistant from both armies, and deliver his challenge with a voice that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath his feet. The words had become ritualistic through repetition, yet they lost none of their power to inspire terror with each recitation. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" the giant would bellow, his voice carrying easily across the ravine to where the Israelite army crouched behind their inadequate fortifications. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." The challenge was more than mere bravado. It was a calculated strategy that revealed the sophisticated military thinking behind Philistine tactics. Representative combat, where single champions fought to determine the outcome of larger conflicts, was an ancient practice that served multiple practical purposes. It avoided the massive casualties that conventional battles produced, conserved resources for both sides, and provided a means of settling disputes without destroying the economic infrastructure that made conquest profitable. But Goliath's challenge carried implications that went far beyond military strategy. In the ancient world, such combat was understood to be a contest not merely between individual warriors, but between the gods they served. When champions met in battle, their respective deities were believed to participate in the conflict, with victory going to the warrior whose god possessed superior power. For Goliath to stand unchallenged day after day was tantamount to a declaration that the gods of Philistia were stronger than the God of Israel. This theological dimension of the challenge explained why the giant's daily ritual had such a devastating effect on Israelite morale. Every word he spoke was a blasphemy against the covenant that defined their identity as a nation. When he mocked their God, he was attacking the very foundation of their existence as a people set apart for divine purposes. When he challenged their warriors to single combat, he was essentially claiming that their god was too weak to provide a champion capable of defending his own honour. The psychological warfare was masterfully executed and devastatingly effective. 40,000 men who had proven their courage in countless skirmishes and battles now found themselves paralysed by a terror that went deeper than mere fear of death. They were witnessing what appeared to be the complete validation of their enemies' claims, the demonstration that all their religious beliefs and national hopes were nothing more than comforting delusions. King Saul himself was perhaps the most tormented of all. As the monarch who bore ultimate responsibility for Israel's defence, he understood better than anyone the impossible position in which Goliath's challenge had placed them. To ignore the giant's taunts was to admit cowardice and invite certain invasion. To accept the challenge was to send some unfortunate warrior to certain death against an opponent who seemed more force of nature than human being. The king had privately consulted with his most experienced commanders, seeking some tactical solution to their dilemma. Could they perhaps organize a coordinated attack by multiple warriors? The rules of representative combat forbade such strategies, and attempting to violate those rules would give the Philistines justification for a full-scale assault. Could they withdraw from the valley and force the Philistines to attack their fortified positions? Such a retreat would be interpreted as an admission of defeat and would likely trigger a general uprising among Israel's enemies. Night after night, Saul paced his tent like a caged animal, wrestling with options that all led to disaster. His advisors offered suggestions that ranged from the desperate to the absurd, hiring foreign mercenaries, seeking divine intervention through elaborate sacrifices, even attempting to negotiate with the Philistines for more favourable terms of surrender. Nothing seemed to offer any hope of escape from the trap that Goliath's challenge had created. The giant's daily appearances had taken on the character of a religious ritual, complete with ceremonial elements that added to their psychological impact. He would arrive at precisely the same time each morning, following the same route through the valley, positioning himself at the exact centre of the open ground. His armour-bearer would take up station at a specific distance, holding the massive shield at an angle that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant flashes toward the Israelite lines. The challenge itself was delivered with theatrical precision, each word carefully enunciated to carry maximum impact across the intervening space. Goliath's voice had been trained for this purpose, developing the resonant quality that made every syllable sound like a thunderclap. He would begin with a mocking assessment of the Israelite army's formation, noting their defensive posture and questioning their courage. Then would come the formal challenge, delivered with the authority of a man who had never known defeat in single combat. "I defy the armies of Israel this day," the giant would roar, his words echoing off the valley walls like the pronouncement of an ancient oracle. "Give me a man, that we may fight together." The silence that followed these challenges was perhaps more devastating than the words themselves. 40,000 throats remained sealed. 40,000 pairs of eyes found urgent business elsewhere. 40,000 hearts acknowledged the terrible truth that no man among them possessed the combination of skill, strength, and sheer audacity necessary to face such an opponent. The Philistine soldiers had begun to treat these daily spectacles as entertainment, gathering in informal groups to watch their champion humiliate the Israelite army. They would cheer his arrival, applaud particularly effective insults, and laugh openly at the obvious terror his presence inspired among their enemies. For them, Goliath's dominance confirmed everything they believed about the superiority of their civilization, their military system, and their gods. The strategic implications of the standoff extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Every day that passed without an Israelite response strengthened Philistine claims to regional supremacy and encouraged other enemy nations to consider their own campaigns against a kingdom that appeared to have lost its divine protection. Egyptian spies reported the situation to their pharaoh, who began making plans to reclaim territories that had been lost to Israel generations earlier. Moabite and Ammonite raiders grew bolder in their incursions across Israel's borders, sensing weakness at the heart of their enemy's military structure. Within Israel itself, the psychological damage was spreading like a plague through the social and political fabric of the nation. Tribal leaders who had submitted to Saul's authority began to question whether the monarchy had been a mistake, whether they should return to the old system of judges who had at least been able to call upon divine intervention in times of crisis. Religious leaders struggled to explain how the God who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho could allow his people to be humiliated by a single pagan warrior. The economic impact was equally severe. With the army tied down in an apparently hopeless confrontation, normal trade and commerce ground to a halt. Farmers abandoned their fields to answer the military levy, leaving crops to rot in the ground. Merchants cancelled trading expeditions rather than risk their goods on roads that might soon be overrun by victorious enemies. The careful prosperity that had marked the early years of Saul's reign began to crumble under the weight of military expenses and economic disruption. Yet it was among the common soldiers that the crisis cut deepest. These were men who had left their families and occupations to defend their homeland, answering their king's call with the expectation that they would fight for something larger than themselves. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario where their most basic assumptions about courage, honour, and divine protection were being systematically demolished by a single enemy warrior. The daily routine had become a form of psychological torture. Each morning brought the same ritual humiliation, the same demonstration of their apparent helplessness, the same mocking laughter from across the valley. Sleep became elusive as men lay awake wondering how the situation could possibly resolve itself without catastrophic defeat. Conversations grew muted and tense as soldiers struggled to maintain morale in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Some had begun to whisper about desertion, calculating their chances of slipping away from camp under cover of darkness, and making their way back to families who might already be preparing for the worst. Others spoke of surrender, arguing that slavery to the Philistines might be preferable to the slow death of hope that was consuming them day by day. A few of the more religiously minded suggested that perhaps God was using this crisis to punish the nation for sins that required identification and confession. But for most of the soldiers, the standoff had simply become an endurance test that stretched their emotional and spiritual resources to the breaking point. They maintained their positions because they lacked any alternative, performed their duties because routine provided some semblance of normalcy, and waited for something, anything, that might break the terrible stalemate that held them captive. It was into this atmosphere of despair and paralysis that a simple shepherd boy from Bethlehem would soon walk, carrying nothing more than provisions for his brothers and a heart that burned with righteous anger at the insults being hurled against the living God. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform not only the immediate military situation, but the entire understanding of what it meant to trust in divine power rather than human strength. The terebinth trees of Elah had witnessed many battles throughout their long existence, but none that would be remembered and retold for thousands of years. The valley floor that now echoed with the daily taunts of a giant would soon witness a demonstration of faith that would inspire countless generations facing their own impossible odds. And the armies that now cowered in their positions would discover that the God of Israel had not forgotten his people, but was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal his power through the most unlikely of champions. In the shadows of morning mist and the terrible silence of 40,000 frightened hearts, destiny was gathering itself for an explosion that would echo through eternity. The early morning light filtered through the olive groves surrounding Bethlehem as David prepared for what he assumed would be a routine journey to the Israelite camp. Jesse had awakened before dawn, his weathered face etched with the worry that had become constant since his sons marched off to war. 40 days had passed since reliable news had reached them from the valley of Elah, and the old man's paternal anxiety had reached a breaking point that demanded action. "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves," Jesse instructed his younger son, his voice carrying the measured authority of a patriarch who had survived too many wars to take military service lightly. The provisions were generous, enough roasted grain to feed a small unit for several days, fresh bread that would be a luxury in a field camp where soldiers typically subsisted on whatever rations they could scrounge. "Run to the camp to your brothers and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000. The request seemed simple enough, but David understood the deeper currents beneath his father's words. Jesse was not merely sending supplies, he was dispatching his youngest son as an intelligence agent, tasked with assessing the true situation of his brothers and the army they served. The 10 cheeses for the commanding officer were a diplomatic gesture, a way of ensuring that David would be welcomed into the camp, and perhaps gain access to information that ordinary visitors might not receive. "See how your brothers fare and bring back news of them," Jesse continued, pressing a small token into David's hand, a piece of jewellery that would serve as proof that the messenger came with official family authorization. In an age where literacy was limited and formal communications rare, such physical tokens carried the weight of written credentials in later civilizations. David accepted the mission with the quiet competence that had characterized his approach to every responsibility since childhood. He arranged for the care of his sheep, gathered the provisions his father had prepared, and set out while the morning star still gleamed above the Judean hills. The 10-mile journey to Elah would take him through some of the most beautiful countryside in all of Israel, but also through territory that had become increasingly dangerous as the military situation deteriorated. The roads themselves told the story of a kingdom under pressure. What should have been bustling thoroughfares filled with merchants, pilgrims, and travellers had become nearly deserted pathways where only military couriers and the most desperate merchants dared to venture. Villages that David passed showed signs of preparation for siege, wells covered and hidden, grain stores moved to concealed locations, livestock driven into defensive positions where they could be quickly gathered if enemy raiders appeared. As the young shepherd approached the valley of Elah, the sounds of military encampment began to reach his ears long before the armies came into sight. The lowing of cattle, the metallic ring of weapons being sharpened, the voices of thousands of men living in close quarters, all combined to create a low-pitched rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. But there was something wrong with these sounds, something that David's experienced ear detected immediately. This was not the confident bustle of an army preparing for victory. The conversations he overheard carried undertones of anxiety and defeat. The weapons being sharpened rang with a hollow note of desperation rather than eager anticipation. Even the livestock seemed affected by the mood of their human companions, their complaints carrying an edge of distress that spoke to the psychological atmosphere that had settled over the entire camp. David arrived at the Israelite encampment just as the morning deployment was beginning, that daily ritual of military posturing that had become as predictable as sunrise itself. 40,000 men were stirring to reluctant wakefulness, preparing for another day of humiliation that no one had the courage to break or the wisdom to end. The young man left his provisions with the supply keeper and hurried toward the front lines where he expected to find his brothers. The scene that greeted him defied every expectation he had formed during his journey. This was not an army preparing for battle, but a collection of frightened men going through the motions of military readiness while hoping desperately that they would not be called upon to actually fight. The formations were correct, the weapons properly maintained, the officers positioned according to regulation, but the spirit that should have animated these preparations was utterly absent. David spotted his brothers among the ranks of their tribal unit, and their faces reflected the same demoralization that characterized the entire army. Eliab, the eldest, who had always carried himself with the confidence of natural leadership, now stood with shoulders slumped and eyes that avoided looking toward the valley floor. Abinadab and Shammah flanked him, their usual military bearing replaced by the posture of men who had accepted defeat before the battle had even begun. The reunion was brief and muted. David's brothers greeted him with surprised pleasure, grateful for the provisions and news from home, but their attention was clearly focused elsewhere. They answered his questions about their welfare with distracted brevity, their eyes constantly drifting toward the centre of the valley where they knew the morning's torment would soon begin. "You should not have come," Eliab finally said, his voice carrying the protective authority of an older brother, but also an undertone of genuine fear. "This is no place for shepherds or young boys. Return to Bethlehem before—" His words were cut off by a sound that made every man in the Israelite army freeze in terror. Footsteps, slow, measured, and so heavy that they seemed to make the very mountains tremble. Across the valley a shadow was moving, growing larger with each passing moment, until it resolved itself into the figure that had haunted their nightmares for more than a month. Goliath of Gath emerged from the Philistine camp like a force of nature given human form. In the clear morning light, his immense stature seemed even more overwhelming than usual. The bronze armour that had encased his massive frame caught the sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that forced observers to squint or look away. His weapons, casually held but obviously ready for use, spoke of power sufficient to reshape the political landscape of the entire region. David had heard descriptions of the Philistine champion during his journey to the camp, but no second-hand account could have prepared him for the reality of Goliath's presence. The giant was not merely large, he was a manifestation of concentrated malevolence, a walking declaration that the gods of Philistia had sent their ultimate champion to crush the pretensions of Israel's supposedly chosen people. But as David watched the giant take his position in the centre of the valley, something entirely unexpected happened within the young shepherd's heart. Instead of the paralysing fear that had gripped every other Israelite observer, David felt a rising tide of anger that began in his core and spread outward until it consumed his entire being. This was not fear or even awe. This was righteous indignation at a level he had never experienced before. The giant's voice rolled across the valley like thunder, delivering the same challenge that had terrorized the Israelite army for 40 consecutive days. But David heard those words with ears that had been trained in the pastures of Judah to recognize the difference between legitimate authority and empty bluster. This was not the voice of divine judgment or inevitable fate. This was the ranting of a creature who dared to challenge the sovereignty of the living God. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David demanded, his voice cutting through the hushed terror that had settled over his immediate vicinity like morning frost. The question was not rhetorical. It was a genuine expression of outrage that such blasphemy could be allowed to continue unchallenged. The reaction to his words was immediate and revealing. Soldiers near enough to overhear turned to stare at this young stranger, who seemed completely unaware of the hopelessness of their situation. Some looked at David as if he'd lost his mind. Others regarded him with the kind of wonder normally reserved for natural phenomena that defied explanation. His brother's response was swift and sharp. Eliab grabbed David's arm and pulled him away from the front lines, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and genuine alarm. "Why did you come down here?" the eldest brother hissed, his voice low but intense. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You came down to see the battle." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how completely the army's demoralization had infected even David's own family. Eliab was suggesting that his youngest brother had come to the camp as a curious spectator, seeking entertainment from the misfortunes of real soldiers. The implication was that David's outrage was nothing more than naive bravado from someone too young and inexperienced to understand the gravity of their situation. "What have I done now?" David replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to remind his older brother that the shepherd boy had faced dangers that would have tested the courage of any soldier. "Is there not a cause?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging not just Eliab's assessment, but the entire assumption that had paralyzed the Israelite army. Word of the young stranger's remarkable reaction to Goliath's challenge began to spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Here was someone who seemed genuinely puzzled by the army's paralysis, who spoke of the Philistine giant not with terror but with contempt, who appeared to believe that Israel's God was somehow relevant to their military predicament. Within hours, David's words had reached the ears of officers who reported them to commanders who eventually brought them to the attention of King Saul himself. The king's reaction to these reports was complex and layered with psychological undercurrents that reflected his own desperate state of mind. On one level, Saul was intrigued by the possibility that someone in his army might actually possess the courage necessary to face Goliath in single combat. On another level, he was skeptical that such courage could exist in a young man who lacked the military experience that supposedly qualified warriors for such challenges. But underneath both intrigue and skepticism lay a deeper current of hope that Saul dared not acknowledge even to himself. For 40 days, he had been forced to endure the daily humiliation of watching his army cower before a single enemy warrior. The psychological toll had been enormous, adding to the mental torment that already plagued his troubled reign. The possibility that deliverance might come from an unexpected source appealed to something fundamental in the king's increasingly desperate soul. The summons came through military channels with the efficiency that characterized all communications in Saul's well-organized army. David was escorted through the camp by officers whose expressions ranged from curiosity to outright skepticism, past formations of soldiers who watched his passage with the kind of intense attention normally reserved for condemned prisoners walking to their execution. The royal pavilion stood at the centre of the Israelite encampment, its purple fabric and golden cords marking it as the nerve centre of Israel's military operations. Guards stood at attention around its perimeter, their bronze-tipped spears and leather armour identifying them as members of the king's personal bodyguard. These were seasoned warriors who had survived countless battles, men whose loyalty to Saul was based on shared danger and mutual respect rather than mere political calculation. Inside the pavilion, King Saul received David with the complex mixture of hope and skepticism that had characterized his response to the initial reports. The king's physical appearance reflected the strain of his current circumstances. His tall frame seemed somehow diminished, his once commanding presence reduced by the weight of responsibilities that had proven too heavy for any mortal man to bear. The royal robes could not disguise the haunted look in his eyes, or the nervous energy that kept his hands in constant motion. "Are you able to go against this Philistine and fight with him?" Saul asked without preamble, his voice carrying both urgency and doubt. The question was direct and practical, cutting through whatever diplomatic niceties might normally surround such conversations. The king needed to know whether this young shepherd possessed anything more than naive enthusiasm for a task that had proven impossible for every experienced warrior in Israel. David's response revealed the depth of character that had been forged in the solitude of Judean pastures. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," he began, his voice steady and confident despite the extraordinary circumstances. "And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck and killed it. The testimony was delivered without boasting or theatrical embellishment, simply a factual account of experiences that had tested the young man's courage under circumstances where failure meant death. But the implications of his words were staggering to everyone who heard them. Lions and bears were the most dangerous predators in the region, creatures that even experienced hunters approached with extreme caution and elaborate preparation. For a shepherd boy to claim victory over such beasts in hand-to-hand combat was either fantasy or evidence of extraordinary capability. "Your servant has killed both lion and bear," David continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." The comparison was not merely tactical, but theological, placing Goliath in the same category as the predators that David had defeated through divine enabling rather than human strength. But it was David's final declaration that transformed the entire conversation from a military consultation into something approaching prophetic pronouncement. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." The words hung in the air of the royal pavilion like incense before an altar, carrying weight that seemed to come from beyond the young man who spoke them. This was not the bravado of inexperienced youth or the desperation of someone seeking glory through reckless action. This was testimony, a declaration of faith based on personal experience of divine intervention, spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust completely in the power of the living God. King Saul found himself caught between conflicting impulses that reflected the complexity of his own spiritual condition. Part of him wanted to dismiss David's words as the naive enthusiasm of youth, to protect this brave young man from certain death by forbidding him to attempt what no experienced warrior had dared to try. But another part of him, a deeper part that remembered his own early experiences of divine favour, recognized something authentic in David's testimony. The king's decision to allow David to face Goliath was not made lightly or quickly. For long minutes Saul studied the young shepherd's face, searching for signs of doubt or fear that might indicate this was merely a moment of foolish courage that would pass under the pressure of reality. But David's expression remained steady, his eyes clear, his posture reflecting the kind of settled determination that comes only from absolute conviction. "Go, and the Lord be with you," Saul finally said, the words carrying both blessing and resignation. The king understood that he was quite possibly sending a brave young man to his death, but he also recognized that they had reached a point where desperate measures were their only remaining option. What followed was a scene that would have been comical under different circumstances. Saul, seeking to give David every possible advantage in the coming confrontation, insisted on providing him with the finest armour and weapons available in the royal arsenal. The king's own bronze helmet was placed on David's head, his personal coat of mail draped over the young man's shoulders, his sword belted around David's waist. The result was a disaster of proportion and practicality. Saul stood nearly a head taller than David, and his armour hung on the shepherd boy like royal robes on a child playing dress-up. The helmet slipped down over David's eyes, the mail coat dragged on the ground, and the sword was so heavy that David could barely lift it, much less wield it effectively in combat. More importantly, the armour represented everything that David instinctively understood to be wrong with Israel's approach to their current crisis. They were trying to fight a physical battle using physical weapons, matching strength against strength and size against size. But David had learned in the pastures of Judah that true victory came not from superior equipment, but from absolute trust in the power of God to deliver his people against impossible odds. "I cannot walk with these," David said simply, beginning to remove the royal armour with movements that suggested relief rather than reluctance. "For I have not tested them." The explanation was practical and honest, a warrior's acknowledgement that unfamiliar equipment could be more dangerous than helpful in combat. But the deeper truth was that David was choosing to trust completely in the God who had delivered him from lion and bear rather than in human preparations that might actually interfere with divine intervention. As David handed back the king's armor and weapons, Saul experienced a moment of clarity that pierced through the confusion and despair that had clouded his thinking for weeks. Here was faith in its purest form, not the desperate hope that seeks divine help, while trusting primarily in human effort, but the settled conviction that God himself would provide everything necessary for victory. It was the kind of faith that Saul himself had once possessed, in those early days when the Spirit of the Lord had come upon him with power, and he had led Israel to stunning victories against overwhelming odds. But those days seemed like distant memories now, separated from the present by a gulf of disobedience and spiritual decline that Saul could not bridge through mere human effort. As he watched David prepare to descend into the valley armed with nothing more than his shepherd's staff and sling, the king found himself witnessing something he had thought lost forever, the sight of someone who trusted God so completely that impossible odds seemed irrelevant. The moment had arrived for faith to prove itself not in armor, but in trust in God alone. As David prepared to leave the royal pavilion and make his way toward the valley floor, the entire camp held its breath. 40,000 men were about to discover whether the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still had power to deliver his people, or whether their 40 days of humiliation would end in the ultimate catastrophe of watching their only volunteer champion die before their eyes. In the silence that followed David's departure from the king's presence, destiny gathered itself for an explosion that would echo through eternity. The silence that descended upon the valley of Elah was unlike anything the ancient battlefield had ever witnessed. 40,000 Israelite warriors stood frozen along their ridge, their collective breathing seemingly suspended as they watched a solitary figure descend toward the valley floor. Across the ravine, an equal number of Philistine soldiers leaned forward in their formations, straining to comprehend what they were seeing. After 40 days of theatrical military posturing, someone was actually responding to their champion's challenge. David walked with the measured pace of a shepherd who had learned patience through countless hours of watching over vulnerable flocks. His simple tunic and sandals marked him as a civilian, while the wooden staff in his hand identified his profession to anyone familiar with pastoral life. But there was something in his bearing that commanded attention, despite his humble appearance. A quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from some inner source of strength that mere human observers could not fully comprehend. The young man's first stop was the brook that meandered through the centre of the valley, its crystal-clear waters fed by springs in the surrounding hills. This seasonal stream had carved its channel through countless centuries, wearing smooth the stones that lined its bed until they gleamed like polished jewels in the morning sunlight. David knelt beside the flowing water with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the choices made in the next few minutes would echo through eternity. The selection of stones was no casual matter. David's trained eye, sharpened by years of perfecting his marksmanship while protecting sheep from predators, evaluated each potential projectile with the precision of a master craftsman choosing tools for a delicate operation. Size mattered. Too large, and the stone would be difficult to accelerate properly in the sling's pouch. Too small, and it would lack the mass necessary to deliver a decisive blow. Weight distribution was crucial. Any irregularity that might cause the stone to tumble in flight could send it wide of its intended target. But beyond these practical considerations lay deeper factors that only someone with David's experience could appreciate. The surface texture had to be just right. Smooth enough to fly true, but not so polished that it might slip from the sling's leather pouch at the critical moment of release. The density mattered as well. Stones that looked substantial but felt hollow would shatter on impact rather than delivering their full force to the target. One by one, David selected 5 stones that met his exacting standards. Each was roughly the size of a chicken's egg, worn smooth by centuries of water action, dense enough to retain their integrity upon impact, and perfectly balanced for accurate flight. He placed them carefully in the leather pouch that hung from his belt, arranging them so that he could access any one of them instantly without fumbling or delay. The choice to take 5 stones rather than just one has puzzled commentators for generations, but David's reasoning was both practical and prophetic. Goliath had 4 brothers, all giants from Gath who served as champions in the Philistine army. If this confrontation escalated into a broader conflict, David wanted to be prepared for whatever divine providence might require of him. The 5 stones represented not just practical preparation, but absolute faith that God would provide victory regardless of how many enemies might present themselves. As David rose from the brook and turned toward the centre of the valley, Goliath began his approach from the Philistine lines. The giant's movement was deliberately theatrical, designed to maximize the psychological impact of his overwhelming physical presence. Each step was calculated to demonstrate power, each gesture crafted to inspire terror. The bronze armour that encased his massive frame caught and reflected the morning sunlight, creating an almost supernatural brilliance that forced observers to squint or look away. The contrast between the two figures could not have been more dramatic. Goliath advanced like a living siege engine, his weapons and armour representing the accumulated military technology of the most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world. David approached like a pastoral poem given human form, carrying nothing more than the simple tools that had served shepherds for countless generations. Yet there was something in the young man's demeanour that suggested he was not merely confident, but absolutely certain of the outcome. Goliath's armour-bearer preceded the giant by several paces, struggling under the weight of a shield that was larger than most men could lift. This was not merely defensive equipment, but a mobile fortress, designed to provide complete protection while allowing its principal to maneuver freely in combat. The shield's bronze surface had been polished to mirror brightness, creating another layer of psychological warfare as it threw blinding reflections toward any opponent who dared to look directly at it. The giant himself was a masterpiece of intimidation, every aspect of his appearance calculated to inspire despair in potential opponents. His helmet, crafted by the finest smiths in the Philistine cities, bore intricate engravings that seemed to shift and writhe in the changing light. His breastplate, weighing more than most men could carry, displayed the insignia of victories that had made his name a whisper of terror from Egypt to Damascus. Even his greaves, the bronze armour that protected his legs, were works of art that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the civilization he represented. But it was Goliath's weapons that truly captured the imagination and paralysed the will of ordinary warriors. The spear he carried casually in one hand possessed an iron head that weighed 15 pounds, more than most swords, mounted on a shaft as thick as a weaver's beam and nearly 20 feet in length. The javelin that hung at his side could punch through any armour ever forged, while the sword strapped across his back was broad enough to cleave a horse in half with a single stroke. As the two opponents closed to within speaking distance, Goliath's reaction to his challenger was a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The giant had spent 40 days issuing his challenge, expecting eventually to face Israel's greatest warrior, perhaps one of Saul's sons or a renowned champion from one of the tribes. Instead, he found himself confronting what appeared to be a shepherd boy, who seemed barely old enough to grow a proper beard. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" Goliath bellowed, his voice carrying easily across the valley to both armies. The question was more than rhetorical. It was an expression of genuine fury that the Israelites had apparently sent a child to face him in single combat. The insult was profound, suggesting that Israel's army considered their champion so insignificant that any random peasant would suffice as an opponent. The giant's rage was magnificent and terrible to behold. His face, visible beneath the bronze helmet, flushed with anger that seemed to radiate from his entire being. He raised his massive spear and shook it toward the Israelite lines, as if challenging the entire army to explain this apparent mockery of legitimate warfare. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." The threat was not empty rhetoric, but a statement of intended fact. In the warfare of the ancient world, the disposal of an enemy's body carried profound religious and political significance. To leave a warrior unburied was to deny his soul rest in the afterlife, while demonstrating the complete dominance of the victor. Goliath was promising not merely to kill David, but to disgrace him in ways that would horrify any observer who understood the cultural implications. David's response revealed the depth of character that had been forged in the solitude of Judean pastures and refined through years of intimate fellowship with the living God. Instead of being intimidated by the giant's threats, the young shepherd seemed to grow taller as he spoke, his voice carrying across the valley with a clarity and authority that commanded attention from both armies. "You come to me with a sword, with a spear and with a javelin," David declared, his words ringing out like a prophetic proclamation that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The theological implications of David's response were staggering to everyone who heard them. He was not merely accepting Goliath's challenge for single combat. He was transforming the entire confrontation from a contest between individual warriors into a cosmic battle between the God of Israel and the false deities of Philistia. This was no longer about military strategy or personal courage. It was about the fundamental question of which God possessed ultimate power over the affairs of nations. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand," David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." The prophecy was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. David was not merely predicting his own victory over Goliath, he was declaring the complete defeat of the entire Philistine army. More significantly still, he was proclaiming that this victory would serve as a demonstration to the entire known world that the God of Israel was the only true deity, the sovereign ruler whose power extended over all nations and peoples. "Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear," David concluded, his final words addressing the fundamental theological issue that lay at the heart of Israel's current crisis. "For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." The declaration sent shockwaves through both armies, though for vastly different reasons. Among the Israelites, David's words awakened memories of their national history that had been buried under decades of military failure and political compromise. This was the voice of their ancient faith speaking again, reminding them that their ancestors had conquered this land not through superior weapons or military genius, but through absolute trust in divine power. The Philistines, meanwhile, heard in David's proclamation an echo of the religious fanaticism that had made Israel such a troublesome neighbour for generations. Unlike other nations, whose gods could be negotiated with, bribed, or simply ignored when convenient, Israel's deity seemed to demand exclusive loyalty and to intervene directly in human affairs. The possibility that such intervention might occur in the present confrontation was deeply unsettling to warriors who had built their careers on predictable applications of superior force. As David finished speaking, he reached into his shepherd's pouch and selected one of the 5 smooth stones he had gathered from the brook. The movement was casual, almost absent-minded, as if he were simply preparing for routine target practice rather than the most consequential single combat in recorded history. He fitted the stone into the leather pocket of his sling, with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this action thousands of times under circumstances where accuracy meant the difference between life and death. The sling itself was a marvel of simple engineering that modern people often underestimate. Far from being a child's toy, this was a sophisticated weapon that in the hands of an expert could drive a projectile with devastating force and pinpoint accuracy. The leather cords were precisely measured to provide optimal velocity, while the pocket was shaped to release the stone at exactly the right moment in the weapon's rotation. David's mastery of this ancient weapon had been earned through countless hours of practice in the hills of Judah, where missing a target could mean losing a sheep to predators and facing his father's disappointed questions about his competence as a shepherd. He had learned to compensate for wind direction, to calculate trajectory by instinct, to adjust his aim for targets at various distances and angles. Most importantly, he had learned to trust completely in the weapon's capabilities when used with proper technique and absolute confidence. Goliath, meanwhile, had begun his own final preparations for combat. The giant hefted his massive spear, testing its balance with movements that demonstrated years of training in its use. He adjusted his grip on the weapon, positioning it for the devastating thrust that had ended the lives of so many opponents throughout his career. His armor-bearer moved to a predetermined position, angling the enormous shield to provide maximum protection while leaving Goliath free to maneuver. The tension in the valley had reached a level that seemed almost unbearable. 80,000 warriors held their collective breath as two figures prepared to engage in combat that would determine not only their individual fates, but the destiny of nations. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays creating a natural amphitheatre where light and shadow would provide the backdrop for a confrontation that would be remembered and retold for millennia. In the Israelite lines, soldiers gripped their weapons with white knuckles while offering desperate prayers to the God of their fathers. Some called upon the memory of Moses, who had stretched out his rod and divided the Red Sea. Others invoked the name of Joshua, who had commanded the sun to stand still until victory was complete. All of them hoped against hope that the shepherd boy walking towards certain death might somehow prove to be the instrument of divine deliverance that their desperate circumstances required. Across the valley, Philistine warriors watched with confident anticipation as their champion prepared to add another victory to his already legendary record. They had seen Goliath in action before, had witnessed the terrifying efficiency with which he dispatched opponents who seemed far more qualified for single combat than the young shepherd who now faced him. This confrontation would be brief and decisive, they assured themselves, ending 40 days of tedious military theatre with a demonstration of Philistine superiority that would resonate throughout the region. Neither army fully understood that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the annals of warfare, a demonstration that divine power could work through the most unlikely instruments to accomplish purposes that transcended mere military victory. The stones in David's pouch had been shaped by centuries of flowing water, but they were about to be used by the hand of Providence to reshape the course of human history. As the two combatants closed to the distance where their conflict would be decided in seconds rather than minutes, the entire created order seemed to lean forward in anticipation. This was the moment when faith would prove whether it could indeed move mountains, when a shepherd's trust in divine power would be tested against the most formidable human opposition imaginable. The decisive moment of history hung suspended like a stone in a sling, waiting for the divine signal that would release it to accomplish purposes too wonderful for human minds to fully comprehend. The 7 years of abundance that followed Pharaoh's dreams unfolded exactly as the Hebrew vizier had predicted, transforming Egypt into a marvel of administrative efficiency and strategic preparation. From 1718 to 1711 BC, the Nile's annual floods arrived with perfect timing. The growing seasons blessed the kingdom with ideal weather conditions, and harvests exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Under the supervision of Egypt's new prime minister, a network of granaries rose across the kingdom, their massive stone chambers designed to preserve grain for decades if necessary. The man who had once managed Potiphar's household and later administered a royal prison now oversaw an operation of unprecedented scope and complexity. Teams of surveyors identified optimal locations for storage facilities. Architects designed structures that would protect grain from moisture and pests, and thousands of workers laboured to construct what would become the ancient world's most sophisticated food preservation system. The 20% taxation on agricultural production that seemed burdensome during the abundant years would prove to be the margin between survival and catastrophe when the lean times arrived. The vizier's administrative genius extended beyond mere storage to the creation of detailed record-keeping systems that tracked every bushel of grain collected, every facility where it was stored, and every official responsible for its preservation. Clay tablets and papyrus scrolls documented the vast operation with mathematical precision, creating an information network that allowed central authorities to monitor food supplies throughout the kingdom in real time. As the years of abundance progressed, the Hebrew administrator's reputation spread throughout the ancient world. Neighbouring kingdoms sent diplomatic missions to study Egypt's preparation strategies, though few possessed either the resources or the governmental sophistication necessary to implement similar programs. Trade delegations carried reports of Egypt's unprecedented prosperity back to their homelands, establishing the kingdom's reputation as the region's most stable and well-governed civilization. During this period of success and recognition, the vizier married Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. This union represented far more than a personal alliance. It was a strategic integration into Egypt's religious and social hierarchy that cemented his position within the kingdom's power structure. The marriage produced 2 sons, whose names reflected their father's complex relationship with his past and his gratitude for divine providence. The firstborn was named Manasseh, meaning making to forget, because God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. The name captured the vizier's deliberate choice to focus on his present responsibilities rather than dwelling on the injustices and sorrows that had marked his journey to power. The second son received the name Ephraim, meaning fruitful, because God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. These names together told the story of a man who had found purpose and prosperity in circumstances that began with betrayal and suffering. Yet even as the Hebrew administrator built a new life in Egypt, establishing himself as one of the ancient world's most successful governmental leaders, the covenant promises that had shaped his youth remained unfulfilled. The dreams of sheaves and celestial bodies bowing before him seemed increasingly distant as years passed without any contact from his family in Canaan. His brothers, who had sold him into slavery to prevent his prophetic visions from coming true, appeared to have succeeded in permanently severing him from his destiny as their leader. The transition from abundance to famine came exactly as predicted, beginning in 1711 BC with failed harvests that spread across the entire ancient Near East. The Nile's floods, which had been perfectly timed for 7 consecutive years, now failed to materialize according to normal patterns. The growing seasons that had blessed Egypt with ideal conditions now brought drought, locusts, and crop diseases that destroyed agricultural production throughout the region. What made this famine particularly devastating was its geographic scope. Previous famines had typically affected limited regions, allowing populations to migrate to unaffected areas or receive assistance from neighbouring kingdoms. But the crisis that began in 1711 BC extended from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Mediterranean coast to the Arabian Peninsula, creating a humanitarian disaster that threatened the survival of entire civilizations. Egypt's preparation proved its value immediately. While other kingdoms watched their populations begin to starve, Egypt's granaries released carefully measured quantities of stored grain that sustained both the local population and growing numbers of refugees who fled to the Nile Valley seeking food. The vizier's administrative systems, tested during the years of abundance, now demonstrated their effectiveness under crisis conditions. The distribution program was both generous and carefully controlled. Egyptian citizens received priority access to stored grain at subsidized prices that ensured their survival without completely depleting reserves. Foreign refugees and traders were accommodated through a complex system of payments that included silver, livestock, land, and even personal service when other resources were exhausted. The kingdom that had prepared for famine now found itself in the position of determining who would live and who would die across much of the ancient world. Reports of Egypt's food availability spread rapidly throughout the famine-stricken regions, carried by traders, refugees, and diplomatic missions seeking assistance for their suffering populations. Among the many kingdoms forced to send delegations to Egypt was the land of Canaan, where the drought had proven particularly severe and the lack of advanced storage facilities had left the population facing starvation. In the tents of Jacob near Hebron, the old patriarch faced a crisis that threatened to complete the destruction of his family that had begun 22 years earlier with the loss of his beloved son. The flocks that had provided the household's wealth were dying for lack of pasture. The wells that had sustained his people for generations were running dry, and the grain supplies that might have carried them through a normal drought were exhausted after multiple seasons of failed harvests. The irony of Jacob's situation was profound and tragic. The man who had been blessed with divine promises about his descendants, becoming a great nation, now watched those descendants face extinction through starvation. The covenant that had sustained him through decades of struggle seemed powerless against the practical reality of empty granaries and dying livestock. It was in this desperate context that reports reached Jacob about grain availability in Egypt. Traders who had made the journey south returned with stories of abundant supplies, efficient distribution systems, and a government willing to trade food for payment in silver or other valuable goods. For a family facing starvation, Egypt represented the only viable hope for survival. Jacob's decision to send his sons to Egypt required him to overcome deep personal reluctance and painful memories. The journey would separate him from his remaining children during a time when family unity seemed essential for survival. More troubling, it would require him to trust the same sons who had deceived him about their brother's fate, with a mission that could determine the family's future. The conversation in which Jacob instructed his sons to travel to Egypt was heavy with unspoken grief and barely controlled desperation. "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of a father who had already lost too much. "Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." The Hebrew phrase he used, "that we may live and not die," captured the stark reality facing his household. Yet even in this moment of desperate need, Jacob's lingering pain over his lost son influenced his decision-making. But Jacob did not send Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. The old patriarch's refusal to risk Rachel's remaining son revealed both his continued grief over the presumed death of that son's older brother, and his lack of trust in the remaining son's ability to protect their younger sibling. The group that departed for Egypt consisted of 10 men whose shared secret had bound them together in guilt and deception for more than 2 decades. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher each carried within himself the knowledge of what they had done to their brother and the ongoing deception they maintained about his fate. The journey to Egypt, undertaken out of necessity rather than choice, would confront them with consequences they had never imagined when they sold that brother to Ishmaelite traders near Dothan. The 300-mile journey from Canaan to Egypt took the brothers through territories devastated by the same famine that had driven them from their homeland. Empty villages, abandoned fields, and streams of refugees moving toward the Nile Valley provided constant reminders of the crisis that threatened to destroy entire civilizations. The contrast between this desolation and the reports of Egyptian abundance only emphasized their complete dependence on a foreign power for their family's survival. When Jacob's sons finally reached the administrative centers where Egypt distributed grain to foreign buyers, they encountered a bureaucratic system of stunning sophistication and efficiency. Officials processed hundreds of requests daily, evaluated payment methods, arranged for transportation of purchased grain, and maintained detailed records of all transactions. The brothers, accustomed to the relatively simple trading practices of pastoral life, found themselves navigating a complex governmental apparatus that reflected Egypt's advanced civilization. The brothers' request for an audience with high-level officials to negotiate a substantial grain purchase eventually brought them before the vizier himself, though they had no idea that the powerful Egyptian administrator reviewing their case was the brother they had betrayed decades earlier. The man who sat before them bore little resemblance to the 17-year-old they had cast into a pit near Dothan. His head was shaved in Egyptian fashion, his body clothed in the fine linen of high office, his bearing marked by the authority and confidence that came with years of wielding enormous power. More significantly, the brothers' own appearance and demeanour had changed dramatically during the intervening years. The young men who had once schemed against their father's favourite were now middle-aged heads of households, their faces weathered by decades of outdoor labour, their postures reflecting the weariness that comes from years of responsibility and struggle. The family dynamics that had once defined their relationship seemed distant and irrelevant in the face of their current desperate circumstances. The vizier's recognition of his brothers was immediate and overwhelming, though he maintained perfect composure while processing the emotional impact of this unexpected reunion. 22 years of wondering about his family's welfare, of grief over separation from his father, of questions about whether his brothers had ever felt remorse for their actions. All of these emotions crashed over him simultaneously as he looked upon the men who had shaped his destiny through their cruelty. Yet his brothers showed no signs of recognition, addressing him with the deference appropriate to his exalted position, while remaining completely unaware of his true identity. They bowed before him exactly as his adolescent dreams had predicted, fulfilling prophecies they had tried to prevent through their act of betrayal. The irony was profound. The very men who had rejected his claims of future authority now prostrated themselves before him, seeking favours that only he could grant. The response that came from Egypt's second-in-command was carefully calculated to test both his brothers' current character and their honesty about family circumstances. Speaking through interpreters to maintain his disguise, he accused them of being spies sent to observe Egypt's defensive weaknesses. "You are spies," he declared. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land." This accusation placed the brothers in immediate danger, while creating an opportunity for the vizier to evaluate how they would respond under pressure. Their defense revealed important information about family circumstances and demonstrated whether the character flaws that had led to their betrayal of him decades earlier had been corrected through time and experience. "No, my lord," they replied, "but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one-man sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Their response included crucial intelligence about their father's continued survival and their own self-perception as honest men, a characterization that would have been ironically amusing if the circumstances had been less serious. The interrogation that followed was designed to extract information about Benjamin while testing the brothers' truthfulness about family matters. "You are spies," the vizier repeated. "In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." The mention of their youngest brother created visible distress among the 10 men, confirming the vizier's suspicions about family dynamics, while revealing their protective attitude toward Benjamin. Their obvious reluctance to bring their youngest brother to Egypt suggested that some lessons had been learned from past tragedies, even if they remained unaware of their connection to those events. The 3-day imprisonment that followed gave the brothers time to discuss their situation and reflect on possible reasons for their unexpected troubles. The conversations that took place during those days of confinement revealed how the guilt they had carried for decades continued to influence their interpretation of current events. "We are truly guilty concerning our brother," they said to one another, unaware that their words were being understood by the Egyptian official who held their fate in his hands. "We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us." The admission confirmed that their memories of betraying their brother remained vivid and painful, and that they interpreted their current crisis as divine judgment for past sins. Reuben's response revealed his continued sense of responsibility as the eldest son, and his ongoing guilt over failing to prevent the tragedy that had befallen their family. "Did I not speak to you, saying, 'Do not sin against the boy,' and you would not listen?" Therefore, the grain purchased during the brothers' first journey to Egypt sustained Jacob's household through several months of continued famine. But by 1710 BC, their supplies were nearly exhausted, and the crisis in Canaan showed no signs of abating. The rains that should have replenished the wells remained absent, the pastures that should have supported their flocks lay barren, and the prospect of another growing season without adequate seed grain threatened to make their situation hopeless. Jacob's resistance to sending Benjamin to Egypt had held firm for months, despite the increasingly desperate circumstances facing his household. The old patriarch, now approaching his 130th year, clung to Rachel's remaining son with the fierce protectiveness of a man who had already lost too much. Yet the practical realities of starvation were gradually overwhelming his emotional objections, creating an unbearable tension between his need to preserve Benjamin's safety and his responsibility to ensure his family's survival. The conversation that finally broke Jacob's resolve was initiated by Judah, whose natural authority among his brothers had grown stronger with age and experience. Unlike Reuben's impulsive offers of his own sons as hostages, Judah's approach demonstrated the kind of measured reasoning that had made him increasingly influential in family decisions. "The famine is severe over us," Judah began, his words carrying the weight of undeniable reality. "If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" The fourth son's presentation of their options was stark and uncompromising. Either Benjamin travelled to Egypt, or the entire family would starve. Jacob's response revealed the depths of his continuing anguish over past losses and his inability to understand how his family had reached such desperate circumstances. "Why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether you had yet a brother?" The patriarch's question suggested that he blamed his sons for creating the current crisis through their honesty about Benjamin's existence, unaware that their trouble stemmed from much deeper sources. The brothers' explanation of their encounter with Egypt's vizier demonstrated how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered by someone whose identity remained hidden from them. "The man asked us pointedly about ourselves and our family," they replied, recounting an interrogation that had seemed like routine administrative questioning at the time. "Is your father still alive? Have you another brother?" And we told him according to these words. Could we possibly have known that he would say, "Bring your brother down"? Judah's final appeal combined personal accountability with practical urgency in a way that finally broke through Jacob's resistance. "Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. For if we had not lingered, surely by now we could have returned this second time." The transformation in Judah's character was remarkable when compared to the man who had once suggested selling his brother to slave traders for 20 pieces of silver. The years had taught him something about responsibility, sacrifice, and the true meaning of brotherhood. His willingness to stake his own future on Benjamin's safe return represented the kind of moral growth that suffering and experience can sometimes produce in human hearts. Jacob's reluctant agreement to let Benjamin travel to Egypt came with careful preparations designed to maximize their chances of success and minimize potential dangers. "If it must be so, now do this," he instructed his sons with the weariness of a man surrendering to circumstances beyond his control. "Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessels and carry down a present for the man. A little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds." The gifts Jacob selected represented the finest products that Canaan could offer, despite the famine's devastating impact on agricultural production. The luxury items, aromatic resins, rare spices, and choice nuts, were the kind of presents that demonstrated respect for Egyptian authority, while showcasing the quality of goods that peaceful trade relationships might produce in better times. More significantly, Jacob instructed his sons to take double the amount of silver necessary for purchasing grain, including the money that had mysteriously been returned in their sacks during the previous journey. "Take double money in your hand," he told them, "and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks." Perhaps it was an oversight. The old patriarch's assumption that the returned silver represented an administrative error revealed his inability to imagine the true reasons for Egyptian generosity toward his family. The blessing Jacob pronounced over his sons as they prepared to depart carried both his desperate hope and his resigned acceptance of divine will. "And may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved." These words echoed the faith that had sustained him through decades of struggle, even as they acknowledged his powerlessness to control the outcome of this crucial mission. The journey to Egypt during Benjamin's first trip was markedly different from his brother's previous experience. The young man's presence seemed to energize the group, reminding them of their responsibility to protect Jacob's remaining joy, while creating opportunities for conversations that had been impossible during their guilt-ridden first journey. Benjamin himself, now in his early 20s, displayed the intelligence and character that had made him precious to his father, while showing none of the arrogance that had once characterized his older brother's behavior. When the 11 brothers presented themselves at the Egyptian administrative center, where grain was distributed to foreign buyers, the response they received was immediate and unprecedented. Rather than being processed through normal bureaucratic channels, they were directed to the vizier's personal residence with instructions to prepare for a midday meal. This unexpected honour created both gratitude and anxiety among men who had learned to interpret unusual events as potential threats. The steward who managed the vizier's household arrangements displayed a warmth and consideration that seemed inconsistent with normal Egyptian treatment of foreign grain buyers. When the brothers expressed concern about the silver that had been returned in their sacks, his response was both reassuring and mysterious. "Peace be with you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." This statement suggested divine favour rather than administrative oversight, though the brothers remained too focused on immediate concerns to fully comprehend its implications. The reunion with Simeon provided the first hint that their reception in Egypt involved more than routine diplomatic courtesy. The second son, who should have been weakened by months of imprisonment, appeared well fed and in good health, suggesting that his captivity had been more comfortable than they had feared. His obvious relief at seeing his brothers, combined with his reluctance to discuss his treatment in detail, added to the growing sense that their situation was more complex than it appeared. The preparations for dining in the vizier's house required the brothers to navigate cultural protocols that were entirely foreign to their pastoral background. Egyptian dining customs involved elaborate arrangements based on social hierarchy, ritual purification requirements that reflected religious beliefs, and sophisticated etiquette that demonstrated the host's refinement and the guest's proper respect. For men accustomed to the informal meal practices of nomadic life, this formal entertainment was both intimidating and educational. When the vizier himself arrived for the meal, the brothers' presentation of their gifts and their formal expressions of respect followed the careful instructions Jacob had provided. "We have brought down a present for our lord," they declared, bowing before the powerful Egyptian official whose identity remained hidden from them. Their inquiry about their father's welfare, "Your servant, our father, is in good health. He is still alive," was delivered with the kind of deference appropriate to their desperate circumstances. The response their question received revealed emotions that Egyptian officials were not supposed to display. "Is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me?" the vizier asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the overwhelming impact of seeing Benjamin for the first time in over 2 decades. The blessing he pronounced over Rachel's younger son, "God be gracious to you, my son," carried an intensity that seemed disproportionate to normal diplomatic courtesy. The vizier's sudden departure from the dining hall, ostensibly to attend to urgent business, allowed him to weep privately while processing the emotional impact of seeing both Benjamin and his other brothers healthy and together. The man who commanded the second most powerful position in the ancient world found himself overwhelmed by feelings that had been buried for 22 years, but remained as powerful as ever. The meal that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation designed to test his brother's attitudes toward Benjamin, while demonstrating knowledge that no Egyptian official should have possessed. The seating arrangement placed the brothers in perfect order according to their ages, from Reuben the eldest to Benjamin the youngest, a detail that should have been impossible for any foreigner to know. Their obvious amazement at this precise knowledge was noted carefully by their host, who continued to maintain his disguise while gathering intelligence about their character development. The special treatment accorded to Benjamin during the meal was both generous and deliberately provocative. So they took portions to them from before him, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. This favoritism was designed to recreate the family dynamics that had once led to violence, testing whether the brothers had learned to control their jealousy, or whether they would respond to Benjamin's privileged treatment with the same resentment they had once shown toward another favoured brother. The brothers' reaction to Benjamin's special treatment was carefully observed by their host, who was relieved to see no signs of the jealousy and resentment that had once poisoned their family relationships. Instead, they seemed genuinely pleased by their youngest brother's honour, demonstrating a maturity and generosity that suggested real character growth during the intervening years. The final test that would determine whether the brothers had truly changed came through an elaborate deception involving a silver cup and accusations of theft. As the brothers prepared to depart Egypt with their grain purchases, the vizier's steward was secretly instructed to place his master's personal drinking cup in Benjamin's grain sack, creating evidence that would justify serious charges against Jacob's youngest son. The pursuit that overtook the brothers shortly after their departure from the city was both dramatic and terrifying. "Why have you repaid evil for good?" the steward demanded when he caught up with their caravan. "Is not this the one from which my lord drinks, and with which he indeed practices divination? You have done evil in so doing." The accusation of stealing the vizier's personal cup was serious enough to warrant severe punishment, while the mention of divination added religious implications that made the offence even more grave. The brothers' confident denial of the theft charges reflected their genuine innocence and their trust in one another's honesty. "With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die. And we also will be my lord's slaves," they declared, unaware that their challenge would soon expose them to exactly the kind of crisis they had hoped to avoid. The discovery of the cup in Benjamin's sack was as shocking to them as it was devastating to their hopes of returning safely to their father. The return to the vizier's house under charges of theft represented the complete collapse of everything the brothers had hoped to accomplish. Not only had they failed to secure grain for their starving family, but they now faced the prospect of losing Benjamin to Egyptian justice, while explaining to Jacob how his remaining son from Rachel had been lost to circumstances beyond their control. The brothers' response to this crisis revealed how profoundly their characters had been shaped by decades of guilt and suffering. Rather than abandoning Benjamin to save themselves, they chose to remain together and face whatever judgment awaited them. "What shall we say to my lord?" Judah asked when they stood before the vizier once again. "What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my lord's slaves, both we and he also with whom the cup was found." The vizier's response to their collective offer of slavery was designed to create maximum pressure on their family loyalty, while testing their willingness to sacrifice for Benjamin's welfare. "Far be it from me that I should do so," he declared. "The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your father." This judgment placed the brothers in an impossible position. They could save themselves by abandoning Benjamin, or they could remain loyal to their youngest brother and face their father's devastating grief over the loss of his last link to Rachel. Judah's response to this ultimate test demonstrated the complete transformation his character had undergone since the day he had suggested selling their brother to Ishmaelite traders. His plea to the vizier was one of the most eloquent and moving speeches recorded in ancient literature, revealing a man who had learned the true meaning of responsibility, sacrifice, and love. "O my lord," Judah began, "please let your servant speak a word in my lord's ears, and do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh." The respect and humility in his approach contrasted sharply with the calculating selfishness that had once characterized his decision-making, showing how suffering and experience had taught him wisdom. The account Judah provided of their family circumstances was detailed and heartbreaking, revealing the intimate knowledge of his father's emotional state that came from years of watching Jacob grieve for his lost son. My lord asked his servants, saying, "Have you a father or a brother?" And we said to my lord, "We have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, who is young. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him." The description of Jacob's attachment to Benjamin and his refusal to let the young man travel to Egypt initially provided context that explained why losing Benjamin would destroy the old patriarch completely. "Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen, when he sees that the lad is not